Good evening to everyone. Let me just make sure I've got this zoomed in nicely to make it easy to read. I hope that everybody had a wonderful Rosh Hashanah and is gearing up for Yom Kippur, when the proper acts of teshuvah, our self-reflection and our attempts to remedy any of the errors that we are still clinging on to as we go into the new year. Hopefully this discussion in tonight's Mishnah for Niddah will help us realize that there are always ways to deal with just about any situation. And even if we're not sometimes happy or satisfied with those situations, we can find a way to navigate it. We'll also see, I'm pretty sure in our timeline, that we'll reach the section in chapter 7 dealing with Kutim. These are people that are referred to in other language as Samaritans, that there is also much room under the right circumstances for extending a great deal of consideration for people that may even be considerably different than our own group, something that we should always bear in mind, but is especially relevant during this time between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Let's go ahead and jump in. We just ran out of time last time. Well, we went over time a little for chapter 6. So let's go ahead and finish off the last part of chapter 6 before we begin chapter 7. So we are in chapter 6, Mishnah number 14. The text begins. If a woman observed, meaning a discharge of blood on the 11th day at twilight, at the beginning of a menstruation period, at the end of a menstruation period, at the beginning of a ziva period, or at the end of a ziva period, as Dr. Kolb points out, based on Albeck and based on the Talmud, this is a truncated phrase, meaning that it is a very shorthand way of trying to say when there is a sign of a discharge at the end of one or the other of the periods leading into the next period. So it's at the end of the 11th day, then that means it could be the beginning of menstruation, or it could be the very end of that ziva period, and it could be that. So how do we handle it? And vice versa, if it's at the end of the menstruation period and just about time for the ziva period to begin, how do we handle that? So we're talking about these threshold moments of how does it get viewed. Likewise, in part 2, on the 40th day after the birth of a male, or on the 80th day after the birth of a female, meaning again, we're still talking about this twilight, remembering, of course, that in Jewish law, it is at twilight, that time when the stars are about to come out, that we are transitioning from one day to the next. Well, as we've talked about now numerous times, the blood that's cited before that transition would be considered pure. The blood after that transition would be considered ritually impure. So how do we handle this transitional moment? Well, what is the answer? At twilight, in all these cases, behold, these women have made a mistake in their reckoning. So how do we handle it? Well, we have to make an assumption that errs on the side of stringency, meaning that the calculation that was being made, we should assume that there was probably some small, one day kind of off. That means that they would still be counted as wherever they are in a more stringent manner. So because they are because we assume that they have lost count, we would assume that they would be rendered ritually impure under these circumstances. However, Rabbi Yoshua has a different idea. Before you fix the situation for the woman who lack intelligence, come and fix the situation for the wise one. Now, there are some that we see in the commentary here, such as Albeck, that argues that this commentary here is probably meant to refer back to chapter 2, where we were talking about women who were of impaired mental capacity and having another woman that could be their chaperone in case of issues of ritual purity, and then we could rely on them to be compliant. So that is one way to read this particular commentary, that it is out of place. And indeed, that is a not entirely inappropriate. It is not considered heretical to imagine that the edition of the Mishnah that we have has a few things that are susceptible to emendation that would clarify and make it work. Of course, we can also read this text as referring to our point. It's a little bit more of a stretch, though, but Rabbi Joshua could be saying that maybe this is only a problem with regards to the count for women that are not clever, that lack mental capacity, but for women that have mental capacity, maybe we need a different way to fix the situation. That maybe we need to address their needs before we deal with those that would be more likely to lose count. In either case, Rabbi Joshua is not victorious in this argument. And with that, we will bid farewell to chapter 6, unless there are any questions. Okay, so chapter number 7, Mishnah number 1. We are coming back to what I am sure many people would have liked to have had earlier on in this discussion, which is, what are the actual substances that can cause different forms of ritual impurity? We've been talking very much about when a woman may or may not be in that Niddah status, or to have a regular discharge, and we've been talking about some sightings of blood, but the implication of those status is not just about counting and immersion. The implication of that status is also about the transmission of ritual impurity that comes through the various forms of contact with the various forms of emission. So chapter 7 is going to take us into that topic. So here we go. And again, as always, please don't be squeamish. These are natural parts of biology, and there is nothing wrong about the different things that we will be discussing. They are not dirty in a Victorian English sense. They are simply things that do create an issue of ritual impurity, which has ramifications for things that must be done while in ritual purity, which is a very small subset of life for most of the average Jewish person's life. If they're a Kohen, yes, these are much more relevant, especially if they are on the clock, as they were. It was their turn to be officiating. But for most of us, this would be an important consideration, but not a life or death matter. And there was not that's the right word for it. It's sometimes hard to render this in intelligible language in the 21st century that doesn't get the baggage of the previous centuries of English thinking. This is not a abhorrence. This is not a contamination. It is not that there is something wrong with you because you have gone through menstruation or come into contact with a corpse or any of the other things that will be discussed. This is just what happens. And when it happens, these are the rules. So with that in mind, and with hopefully the intent to overcome some of the baggage of puritanical ideas, especially in the United States, let's tackle this. The blood of a menstruant and the flesh of a corpse convey uncleanness when wet and when dry. All right, so again, it's always hard for me to know when people are watching or the class of how many of the different classes they've already attended. But that's why I like to throw in just a little reminder, even if you have attended, maybe you forgot. There are certain instances in Jewish law where the relative moisture of a substance makes a big difference of whether or not that substance can contract or transmit ritual impurity. We're not going to go into all of them, but just to understand that that is one of the yardsticks that is used when measuring the susceptibility or the transmittability of ritual impurity. For tonight, we are focusing on the issues right now, at this part of the Mishnah, on the blood of somebody who is a Niddah, that is through menstruation, and the substances of the corpse, the bodies of a human being. So both of those substances, whether they are fresh and wet and moist, or whether they have become dried and desiccated, will still convey ritual impurity. And that is, of course, as we'll see, different from other substances. Which other substances are they different from? Well, in the next part, but the discharge of a zav, or the phlegm of a zav, the spittle, not the spittle, the throat discharge, and the spittle, the mouth discharge, a dead sheretz, those are the creepy crawly things, lizards and the like, a nevela, which is the corpse of an animal that was not killed according to shechita, according to ritual slaughter, and semen convey uncleanness when wet, but not when dry. So these substances, all the ones just listed, if they are completely dried and desiccated, and we're going to talk about that benchmark in just a second, then they no longer convey ritual impurity. So if there was a completely dry, dead lizard, then it is no longer conveying impurity. It's just like a stick. And if you have the stain on a piece of clothing from a discharge of the various forms mentioned here that has become completely dried, it is no longer rendering ritual impurity. On the other hand, if it is still moist, then it will. All right, clearly this demands a benchmark. What does it mean? If they can be soaked and then revert to their original condition, they convey uncleanness when wet and when dry. And how long must they be soaked? In lukewarm water for a period of 24 hours. All right, so if something is merely dried out, but not actually dried, then even if it's dried out, but not actually, but not wet, it can still convey uncleanness. In order to make a benchmark of that, we have to make an estimate of, if I took this piece of clothing, if I took this piece of dead animal flesh, if I took this dead lizard, and I put it into lukewarm water and I leave it there for 24 hours, will it become moist again? Like actual moisture in the substance itself, not just damp from the water, then that is still only dried out and not dried. And thus, it is still something that will render something ritually impure in contact, even if it's in that middle dried out state. On the other hand, if when I take it out, it's just as dried, rock hard as it was before it went into the water, then it's really dried out. And that is the state that no longer will transmit ritual impurity. It may be hard for you to imagine that, but think of it as like a stain on clothes being set. If you find something that's dry, so when you rub it, it doesn't come off on your hands, but then you take that shirt and you put it into a bucket of water and you leave it there to soak. When you pull it out, if you rub it, does it actually start coming off now? Is it actually, coming to your fingers? Is it showing a reactivation of its shape, of its form? Is it becoming fluid again? If the answer is yes, then even while it was still dry, before you put it in the bucket of water, that level of dryness is not what we mean by truly dry, and that means it will render things unclean. On the other hand, if you pull it out of the bucket of water and it's dry, meaning from the bucket of water, and the substance is still unmoved, it is not reactivating from the water that you soaked it in, well, that's well and truly dry now. That is a dried out substance, and it no longer has a bearing on ritual impurity. Hopefully that makes sense. It depends how much you do laundry, I guess. Rabbi Yossi disagrees. If the flesh of a corpse is dry, it cannot be soaked and brought back to its original condition. It is clean. So Rabbi Yossi is saying, look, if you have a mummy, something that has been absolutely desiccated and dried out, it has no moisture left in it whatsoever. This has been sitting there for 2,000 years. You can soak it in water all you want. The skin is not going to reabsorb that water. It's not going to return to its moist status. You'll just have a wet mummy. Then that means it is ritually clean, and it's no longer considered like a body. It no longer has that corpse tuma, the corpse ritual impurity. Rabbi Yossi loses this argument. As you can imagine, the sages say that a corpse transmits impurity, full stop. And the Torah is very clear on that, and the sages do not make any attempt to change that. Although his argument seems to be a consistent one, the sages are always making logically consistent attempts to interpret, but this is one that the majority does not agree. All right. Hopefully that's clear, because we need that to move on to 7.2. If a dead sheretz, creepy crawly, was found in an alley, it causes uncleanness retrospectively to such a time as one can say, I examined this alley and there was no sheretz in it, or to such time as it was last swept. All right, so we've got our alleyway. We have the walkway out back of our house, of our building, and people would obviously store things in those sorts of places. And while it may not be a constant issue, oftentimes those things we needed to know whether they were ritually impure or not. And as these dead sheretz can cause ritual impurity so well, this was a very important concern. Now, much like we talked about before with the examination, the self-examination of a woman with regards to her cycle, we are following a very similar rule here, meaning that if we go out and there, boom, is a dead lizard, we have to assume that it has come into contact with the things in the alley, because it would have been there to crawl around and do its impurity things on everything in the alley. So we have to say, if it's in there, it was in there. However, if I know that I examined the alley yesterday, and the thing that I brought in from it, from the alley, I brought in before that examination, and there was nothing there, then I can assume that that was not contaminated by the sheretz. Likewise, even if I was just sweeping rather than fully examining, as long as I have gone over the alley and kept it clean, then again, I can assume that the sheretz had to appear after my last sweeping, because otherwise it would have been discovered during that last bout of cleaning up. Now, that basic interpretation here is one that I just want to take a couple seconds to reflect on, because this idea that, well, if I was sweeping the alley and I saw a sheretz, of course, I would have taken note of it, and of course I would have followed the rules appropriately. It is based on a system of a shared understanding of the issue and a shared trust that the average person would follow through on actually taking care of the ritual implications of finding these things in the alley. That's, I'm trying to explain this to a 21st century audience, who is, at least in my own country of the United States, is not very fond of trusting strangers. That is a profound statement, that we are willing to trust others, that they share our concerns and that they share our diligence in taking care of those concerns. And I will trust that then when they hand me something, it was not something that a sheretz was crawling over in an alley, that they would not do that. That means if I go to them and I buy something, I can be confident that this was not contaminated. That shared sense is a very important principle in Jewish law, and that shared trust is a very important ramification of it. Now, which comes first? Well, that's a much longer philosophical definition and discussion. But for the moment, bear that in mind, because we are going to push the edges of shared understanding and shared trust as we continue through chapter 7. So also a bloodstain found on a garment causes uncleanness retrospectively, or retroactively, I would have said, to such time as one can say, I examined this shirt and there was no stain on it, or to such time as it was last washed. Again, now we're talking about our clothes. You find a blood stain on it, then you have to assume that, whoa, where did this blood come from? It must be from something problematic, and therefore it has been rendered ritually impure, and anything it came into contact with, et cetera, I have to deal with. But I don't have to worry about how long that blood stain was been from the last time I checked it and the last time I washed it. It is presumed that anyone who washed or checked their shirt would have noticed it, and that thus anything prior to that last washing or checking is considered to have not come into contact with the actual blood stain. Anything after that, then yeah, I can't be sure because I can't identify. Now, I should point out that if you can easily identify where the blood came from, my shirt was clean this morning, I was killing an animal, and now it's covered in blood, that is the kind of thing that we can generally say the blood came from the slaughtering of the animal. This is talking more about a discovery of a blood stain, not about the normal expectation from dealing with things that are bloody. Going back to our wet and dry conversation, and it, meaning the bloodstained shirt, conveys uncleanness, whether it is wet or dry. Rabbi Shimon says if it is dry, it causes uncleanness retroactively, but if it is wet, it causes uncleanness only to a time when it could still have been wet. So the idea being that we have to measure it along that lines. Now, again, Rabbi Shimon loses this argument, but that was his position. If you'll excuse me, while you consider if you have a question, I need to have a little tea. Okay, sorry, let me just double check our YouTube chat. Nope, nothing there. Okay, now we're getting into the questions of the borders of community and the borders of trust that come with that issue. Like I said, in order for us to be completely trusting of those around us, we need to believe that, one, they share our concerns, in this case, over ritual purity, and two, they would handle issues of ritual purity in a way that would be in keeping with Jewish practice and law. So we need those two things. However, there is a third issue that we need to also discuss before we can get into Mishnah 3 here. And that is that many of the issues of ritual impurity do not apply to people that are not Jewish. So what that can mean is that there are going to be circumstances as we go through where we will be more lenient with a bloodstain or discharge from somebody that is not Jewish than we are from somebody that is Jewish, but we're not sure if we can trust them. So let me put that in full perspective. Because most forms of discharges, of the things we've been discussing, are not considered as sources of ritual impurity if they are found with a non-Jew, it means that oftentimes we will simply ignore, say that's not an issue, when we encounter them in a non-Jewish community. However, if those same bloodstains, for example, show up within a Jewish community that is not one that we trust, then we will be stricter with them. Even though we share more with that Jewish community than we do with the non-Jewish community when it comes to our attitude towards these ritual purity issues, if there is a lack of trust between us and that other Jewish community, we are going to be more skeptical than we would be if the same circumstance was for a non-Jewish group. All right, with that in mind, let's dive into Mishnah number 3. all bloodstains that come from Rechem are clean. All right, so this is the first application of what I just said in terms of leniency. Rechem is considered to be one of the outermost borders of Israel on the eastern side, and it was considered to be a place that, although was in the boundary of Israel, was not considered to be populated by actual Jews, meaning people who were actually Jewish. As such, as non-Jews, their blood, whatever its source, is not considered to be ritually impure. So therefore, bloodstains from that area are considered clean. Rabbi Yehuda, however, declares them unclean because the people who live there are proselytes, they have converted, but they are misguided. So he acknowledges that this is a community that is not keeping the norms of Jewish law. However, in his understanding of the history of that area, he believes that these are people who did convert and their conversion was valid, but they have not been following Jewish law for one reason or another. That means that even though they are behaving like non-Jews with regards to this issue at least, we still have to treat them as though they are Jews, meaning that those bloodstains are unclean because they are produced by people that are actually Jewish. Now, I know that that can sound confusing or contradictory in the modern world, where we like to draw bright lines between different groups and say, my group good, your group bad, my group does right, your group does wrong, my group I like, your group I don't want anything to do with. But Judaism is much more subtle than that. It is much more gray than that. There are many more, much more granularity in trying to understand these topics. Now, yes, Rabbi Yehuda does not win this particular argument about the people of Rechem, but I should point out that this is still an important part of our discussion. So let's continue and see how we do. Those that come from non-Jews, meaning everybody agrees they are non-Jews, are clean. That is non-controversial. If the person lives in the middle of the Siberian steppes, they are definitely not Jewish, especially at the time of the Mishnah, and their bloodstains are definitely clean. Those that come from Israelites or from Samaritans, Rabbi Meir declares them unclean, but the sages declare them clean because they are not suspected in regard to their stains. All right, so here comes our trust question as well as the boundary question. So let's deal with the Israelite part first. Rabbi Meir, the general position of Rabbi Meir is that if we see a stain, we have to assume that since these people are Jewish, that it probably came from something that would render ritual impurity, that it wasn't from slaughtering an animal, it wasn't because of some other issue, it was because of a ritual purity issue, and thus we have to assume that that bloodstain will cause ritual impurity if it comes into contact with things. However, the Hachamim, the sages as a whole, say no, not because the blood would not cause ritual impurity. The blood absolutely would cause ritual impurity if we believed that the blood that they have is from a source that causes ritual impurity. However, we don't have a reason to believe that because we know that the blood, if it came from a certain type of discharge, would render them impure. We know that they know that too. And we believe that they care about that too. And we believe that they would not let something that would cause ritual impurity just stay as a bloodstain on their clothes while walking through the marketplace. So because we know that they could cause ritual impurity, and because we believe they care about it like we care about it, we can assume that with the blood we see on them must have been from slaughtering an animal or something akin to that. So this is the logical steps that allows you to trust another person. When you begin with the assumption that the other person cares about it the same way you do, and that they would take care of it the same way you would take care of it, then when you see something that looks like a problem, you should, as we say, bekaf sahut, on the side of merit, on the side of leniency, interpret what you are viewing as something that is probably perfectly fine. Now, if you get other behavior that clearly shows otherwise, obviously that's something that's going to change the equation there. But average person walking down the street with an average-looking bloodstain, we have to assume that they would not be walking around with that if it was the kind of thing that would cause a problem. Instead, it must be a clean type of bloodstain. Now, I'll pause there. Any questions on that? On that the logical steps needed in order to actually foster trust between people. Again, as you ponder whether you want to have a question or not, recognize that the alternative could have been an option. The rabbis could have said, trust no one. Indeed, Rabbi Meir basically says, trust no one. You never know. Maybe they don't handle it right. Maybe they're just lazy today. Maybe they didn't even notice it. But instead, the sages say, no, we have to begin with the position of trust and the assumption that they are doing things properly until, innocent until proven guilty, you might say, or assumed to be conscientious until something will actually force me to change that assumption. Now, the real interesting part here from a modern perspective, but was also very interesting in the ancient world, are the Kutim, are the Samaritans. So, who are the Samaritans? We've talked about them before, but as always, I like to give that brief reminder. The Samaritans in Rabbinic Judaism are considered to be the descendants of the people that were brought into the land of Israel by the empires that drove our people out during the Assyrian and the Babylonian exiles. So they are non-Jews who were transplanted into the area around Judea, around Israel, that region. And as was common in the ancient world, they adopted the Jewish practices of those local people. The rabbis also believe that they did this with correct intent. They did this with sort of proper kavanah, and that they did this in a way that did render them as Jew-ish, as mostly Jewish, from a legal technical point of view. However, because they were not 100% on board with everything that Judaism actually teaches, they are a border case. They are not non-Jews, and they are not a regular Jew in 100% of the cases. Instead, they are this very unusual borderline kind of person or group that some laws will treat them as though they were not Jewish, and some laws will treat them as though they are Jewish. Here is one where they are being treated as though they were Jewish 100% of the way, meaning that we assume that they also care about ritual purity. We know that they read Torah, we know that they keep purity laws, so therefore we believe that they are interested in ritual purity the same way that we are. We also know that if they had a problem, they would take care of it on the ritual purity front the same way we would take care of it. Therefore, if you see a Samaritan that has a bloodstain on their clothes, because they care about it like we do, and because they would handle it like we do, we can assume that that bloodstain is not something that would cause ritual impurity. Again, we can have individual cases where that is not correct. We can update that based upon their behavior, and indeed, the behavior of the Samaritans as a whole definitely gets updated later on as the centuries passed, and they become more and more distant from Judaism. But at this point in time, that was the ruling. Yes, Aaron.
So, Rabbi, the Samaritans were the people who occupied the land after the first exile?
That is the rabbinic understanding. Modern archaeologists and other scholars have argued that that was probably true, and that they also probably were comprised of many of the Jews that were not taken away in exile, that some Jews were left behind, although there was a marked desolation in the archaeological record. Some people probably did stay and move to other settlements and change some of their behaviors. especially in the absence of the elite portion of the people, the actual leaders and teachers that were forcibly taken away to Babylon. So it may be even more likely that the Samaritans did have a substantial admixture of native-born Jewish people as part of their community, but they were native-born Jewish people that were not part of the exiled Jews, and that did not reintegrate upon the return from exile.
Wouldn't there have to be native Jewish people there for them to take on their customs?
Well, yes, that is part of the assumption. On the other hand, there is also a lot of local knowledge that is sometimes right and sometimes wrong. My favorite example of that is in the United States. There are many people who attempt to recreate the practices of the Native Americans of the United States. Now, sometimes they get that right. They've heard from a friend, some custom, some practice that is actually grounded in the Native American traditions. Other times they've heard partly correct and they get it kind of weird. And other times they've just made stuff up and call it as being Native American and get it completely wrong. And then, of course, I just point out that Native American as a concept is not a great example in the US because that covers a huge range of nations, of people with very different customs. They are not homogenous. They are not, all the same in their beliefs or their practices. Somebody that lived here in Florida would have had very different beliefs, theology, and day-to-day life and practice and culture from somebody who lived in the Pacific Northwest. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that it's a, quote, Native American custom, meaning it's all the same. It could be derived from a Native American community, a nation, but that doesn't mean that any other Native American group was actually participating in it. So yes, there probably was a reasonable amount of Jewish people, or Jewish people at the very least, who helped pass on. There would have also been understanding from the non-Jews that lived among the Jews, that when other people moved in, they would have said, oh, well, the people who used to live here, this is what they did. And the people who moved in, what we would then call the Samaritans, would have learned it from them as well. But secondhand knowledge and imperfect knowledge led to an imperfect adoption of Jewish practice.
Who are these people, the Rechem? Who are they?
So the Rechem is an area that was on the eastern border of the boundary of Israel, and they were a group of people that were considered to be Jewish-ish. Another what's the right word? I don't want to be flippant, but they were another copycat group, another group of people who had strong Jewish practice, but were on the outside the normative boundaries of Jewish practice. Understand, the rabbis knew that there were plenty of Jews who didn't keep Judaism consistently and correctly. I mean, all of us make mistakes, we know that, but there were people even within the regular Jerusalem community that were not so careful in keeping the mitzvot and not so fully seized of the passion of the beliefs of Judaism. But then there were people further out that lived as a whole community that had some Jewish flavor to them, but not even so much as the Samaritans. So it was a Jewish adjacent set of practices.
So does this go, is what separates them? Well, actually, I take that back. What does separate them from the Samaritans? Because I know later on it's going to say if they have the same practice as you, then they follow the same rules, and if they have a separate practice than you follow separate rules. Is that have anything to do with what separates them from the Samaritans here?
Right. So with the Samaritans, there was the empirical research had already been done, meaning that the rabbis didn't just make assumptions about Samaritans from the past. They knew Samaritans. They saw them, and they saw how they behaved, and they saw what they practiced, and they saw what they cared about and what they didn't care about. And the rabbis saw that Samaritans cared about ritual impurity. And the concerns that the Samaritans community had were the same concerns as Rabbinic Judaism. And their remedies were the same remedies as Rabbinic Judaism, or at least within a margin of error on this topic, that the rabbis felt that we could say that they're handling it the way we would handle it well enough. Maybe they're on the border, maybe they're stricter some places, maybe they're a little bit more lenient, but they're still within the parameters of acceptable on average. And that was based upon their empirical, almost anthropological, research into the Samaritan world. But people who were further afield, they had less contact with, and of course, individuals they had no contact with until they actually could produce evidence, empirical evidence of how this person or that community is actually behaving. So yeah, this is based off, it wasn't based off like double-blind demographic, surveys and such, but it was based off fairly substantial anecdotal research of knowing what their neighbors were like.
But
all right,
one more question.
Go ahead.
Because it says Judah, it looks like Judah actually considered them to be converts.
The Rechem people, Judah did consider to be correct converts, but they were converts that didn't actually follow well. And we do have some issues of that, within Jewish history. It's not a very common topic because by and large, Judaism doesn't proselytize in a way that allows for the mass adoption of many people imperfectly, with imperfect knowledge of Jewish law. But there were a couple instances of areas during the Hashmonean period, a few hundred years earlier, where the Hashmoneans, who were not good kings, did drive into areas and did expand Judaism in a forcible way. And thus it would not be surprising that they were not keeping Judaism correctly if these were descendants of some of those Hashmonean drives. That was one of the issues, of course, with Herod, is that he came from one such community.
But I thought Judaism actually converted well before they had a good knowledge of Jewish law. Because I thought back in those days, you said Rabbi Akiva would convert the person up front, and then they'd have to go back.
Absolutely. But that was because that person would become part of a active, living, breathing, and observing community. But converting a village, converting a town, and then essentially abandoning it as the Hashmonean favor, their success waxed and waned, could leave a group of people who sort of consider themselves Jewish, but never really were part of the community to individually learn well enough how to obey Judaism.
Yeah.
So you end up with these vestigial communities that are very questionable. Now, again, for the particular community of Rechem, Rabbi Yehuda says that they were in fact converts, but the other rabbis do not agree with that assertion. So we have to follow the rabbis' assumption that these were not an actual converted group. But like I said, historically, we do know there were this very narrow window when such things could have happened, the way Rabbi Yehuda is suggesting.
Right. And again, back on that thing, I remember we had the conversation before, though, how much of assimilation is part of the conversion. And I remember you said that's actually not one of the elements, but it seems to be a factor that they were considering here.
So again, it's not the assimilation, it would be more the proximity. That, if somebody says, I passionately want to be, converted to Judaism, but I plan to go live on an island by myself, or I plan to move to Madagascar, which at the time of the rabbis and that we're talking about here was completely distant and out of reach. The rabbis would not have converted such a person and given them a book and say, go have fun. They would have said, no, if you want to convert, you're going to have to live with us. And yes, we're willing to convert you before you've mastered everything, because we know that that's a necessary condition. But you do need to still remain in the community so that you can continue to learn and participate.
Right. It looked like Reckon was pretty close to the community. It's right there.
And yet, it apparently did not have a sizable enough Jewish population to be able to provide the stability that was needed. And unfortunately, I don't know much more about the archaeological record or historical record outside of the source of what Rechem was really like. So I can't second guess the rabbinic estimation here. But again, dealing with it in the abstract, that's the topic that they're trying to deal with. All right, I think we've got time maybe just for one more. So we'll continue with Mishnah 4 here. All bloodstains, whether they are found, are clean, wherever they are found. Excuse me, it's the mouth is not keeping up with the eyes anymore. Wherever they are found are clean, except for those that are found in rooms or in a house for unclean women. So, going back to our question about these bloodstains. So now we have bloodstains that are found within a Jewish setting, and it's not on a person, it's just on a piece of cloth, it's on a piece of clothing. Again, we will assume that it is clean, provided it's not found in a room or in a house for unclean women, as those would be the places where it was more likely that the blood that is on it almost certainly must have come from a discharge that would have caused ritual impurity, right? You're not going to find the clothing from ritual impurity just on the side of the road. You're not going to find it just hanging off of the table in the marketplace. We're not going to leave items that cause ritual impurity just lying around like that. Now, will we leave it in our house? Of course we will, because it's waiting there until we can clean it. Will we leave it in a place where women often would leave the things that were ritually unclean from menstruation? Well, yes, that's why they had such places as a repository. So obviously, if you find a piece of clothing that has a blood stain on it there, then of course we're going to read it as being a source of ritual uncleanness. But anywhere else, we trust that no one is just leaving behind a blood rag that would cause ritual impurity. Again, it's a trust thing. A house for unclean Samaritan women conveys uncleanness by overshadowing, because they bury miscarriages there. So here's another Samaritan question where we're going to treat them differently. In the last Mishnah, we treated them the same. In this Mishnah, we treat them differently. So here we have the Samaritans, and they also have a place where women can sometimes go and will deposit items clothing that became ritually impure during their cycle. But we do need to worry about overshadowing, meaning the building creates ritual impurity, not because of blood, but because we believe that miscarriages have been buried in that place. As we've mentioned before, a corpse will cause ritual impurity, not only to those things that touch it, but also those people that are underneath the same covering. The tent, the ohel being the classic example, but a house would also be the same. So if there are bodies buried underneath it, if there is a graveyard, really, then we need to assume that everything underneath that structure is ritually impure because of what's buried there. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, has a slightly different variation, which is not very flattering to the Samaritans at all. They did not bury them, but threw them away, and the wild beasts dragged them off. So Rabbi Yehuda, distressingly, believes that the Samaritans don't bury their miscarriages at all. In Judaism, of course, we bury them in the cemetery, but Rabbi Yehuda says not only do they not bury them there in the ritual, the women's house, they just discard them as being not even worthy of being buried in that place. And as such, the wild animals will just take them and treat them as wild animals will do. Now, do we have any evidence in the modern world for Rabbi Yehuda's assumption or for the assumption of the sages that they buried them in the house? No. Rabbi Yehuda does not succeed in his argument against the sages. The sages, of course, do establish the halacha as they have mentioned here with the assumption of burying there. We can hope that they actually were privy to this knowledge, that this was something that was more than just a screed against the Samaritans. But if you'll pardon the expression, we do have to remember that there was bad blood between the Samaritans and the Jewish population. The Samaritans were not welcoming to the Jewish return from Babylon, and the Samaritans often worked with the Romans against the Jewish population during the Roman occupation. So it is possible that these statements here are not just anecdotal observations, but could be also insults against the Samaritan population. However, like I said in the previous Mishnah, the rabbis are not willing to write off all of the Samaritans completely as being just another group of non-Jews that are hating us. They do see them as having many things in common, even though there is political tension between the two groups. So I will leave it up to you to try and decide from this and other statements about the Samaritans of how we should read it. I personally would just like to say it's complicated. This was a very bad time in the relationship between the two groups. It was made worse because of the outside occupation by the Roman armies. But clearly the rabbis are not going to throw the Samaritans completely away as though they were just beyond the pale, but they are also, we should not be surprised, they're also not going to embrace them with both arms. It's complicated. And with that, we're going to wrap it up for today. Sorry, let me just make sure. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I hadn't forgotten something further down. But with that, we will wrap it up for today. We'll meet again next Wednesday as we continue this topic. I hope that everyone has a very meaningful Yom Kippur. It's complicated, as we just discussed. Oftentimes, the biggest difficulty with Yom Kippur is to try and make amends with people that we have had difficult relationships with. But we should do our best to make that attempt. They may or may not be receptive, but we won't know until we try. And even if they are unreceptive, we have still done what our faith has guided us to do, which is to reach out and to do what we can to apologize for our own mistakes and to be willing to accept a sincere apology from them for their mistakes. With that, we will go ahead and finish. And I'll wish everybody a Gemar Chatima Tova.